It is called a freak-off, this alleged sexual performance that is at the center of this criminal case facing the rapper and producer Sean Diddy Combs. And I'm going to go over some of the details of these freak-off sessions as laid out in the government's indictment and in their subsequent letters that they filed with the court when they argued against Combs' bail, which, by the way, was denied twice. Now, he's currently locked up in the Brooklyn Detention Center. Combs is facing charges of racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, transportation to engage in prostitution. We've mentioned it before, but he could be looking at 15 years to life in prison. That's how serious these charges are. But the main theme here, the main allegation, is that Combs led a criminal enterprise. And the goal of this criminal enterprise, other than to operate a global media and entertainment business, was to engage in the abuse of women, sex trafficking, forced labor, prostitution, the distribution of drugs, to use violence and threats, to commit crimes like kidnapping, arson, bribery, obstruction of justice, to carry out their goals, their missions, all the while making sure to satisfy the sexual desires of Sean Combs. And one of those desires, as alleged by the government, by prosecutors, and also alleged by several Combs accusers in separate civil lawsuits that they filed against him, were the commission of freak-offs. So with that in mind, now we're going to get into these shocking details surrounding these freak-offs. And I guess we should start with saying, what are freak-offs, right? Well, let's go to the indictment. It says, quote, Combs and other members and associates of the Combs enterprise wielded the power and prestige of Combs' role at the Combs business to intimidate, threaten, and lure female victims into Combs' orbit, often under the pretense of a romantic relationship. Combs then used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims to engage in extended sex acts with male commercial sex workers that Combs referred to as, among other things, freak-offs. Freak-offs were elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, pleasured himself during, and often electronically recorded. Now, while this indictment came down, I said at the time, this may be a term that is foreign to any person that was not familiar with Sean Combs, but for me, who's been following this whole saga for, what, a year now, I have heard this term multiple times, because in the Cassandra Ventura lawsuit, Combs' ex-girlfriend, and Rodney Little Rod Jones lawsuit, this is Combs' former producer, they discussed the freak-offs in their sexual assault lawsuits. Now, Ventura alleged, among other things, that Combs would demand her participation in freak-offs and that she would have to be forced to hire the male sex workers and that this could happen at any random moment. Jones alleged, among other things, that Combs' son Justin Combs and DJ and record producer Stevie J would engage in freak-offs. Now, to be clear, those specific allegations, those names, those details were not mentioned as part of the criminal case. I will tell you, though, that the idea of this freak-off, now that it is officially part of the criminal case, now that it's mentioned multiple times, this makes me wonder two things from a legal point of view. Number one, it is such a wild concept and a phraseology that it's hard to believe that this is something that was just made up by Combs' accusers. And when I say Combs' accusers, could that be Ventura? Yes. Could that be Jones? Yes. Perhaps the government got this information, this idea of the freak-offs originally from them. And by the way, when I say Combs' accusers, could be Ventura, could be Jones. Perhaps the government got this idea of the freak-offs from them originally, but we don't know. To be clear, we do not know for sure. We do not know who the accusers are, the victims are in this criminal case, who the government's witnesses are, whoever those people may be, because we don't know for sure who is cooperating with the government right now. But the bottom line is the idea of the freak-off, there's enough there to substantiate it that the government is moving forward with this. And again, it is so wild. It's such a wild concept to come up with that I wonder if an argument will be made that, look, jury, this has to be true. No one can honestly make something like this up. And as you'll see, it doesn't appear it was just witness testimony that corroborates the idea of the freak-offs happening, the existence of these freak-offs, but there's more, and I'll get to that. But this also leads me to a secondary point, that based upon what we are already seeing from Combs' defense counsel during bail arguments, they may not deny that these freak-offs happened, or even that Combs called them freak-offs. They may say, yeah, you know what, he engaged in freak-offs. That's what he called them. But they were consensual. That's the idea. They were consensual. This is not a crime. And I want to explore that a little bit more. Let's explore a little bit more details of these freak-offs. So the indictment continues, quote, freak-offs occurred regularly, sometimes lasted multiple days, and often involved multiple commercial sex workers. During freak-offs, Combs distributed a variety of controlled substances to victims, in part to keep the victims obedient and compliant. Sometimes, unbeknownst to the victims, Combs kept videos he filmed of victims engaging in sex acts with commercial sex workers. After freak-offs, Combs and the victims typically received IV fluids to recover from the physical exertion and drug use. That is something. And the government would allege that these freak-offs, they have been happening since 2009. That those drugs consisted of ketamine, GHB, ecstasy. Now, in terms of the defense of consent, the defense could say, well, these people knowingly and voluntarily took drugs, but if it's true that Combs kept videos that these participants didn't know about, that could be problematic for him, especially since we learned the government may have the goods to back all of this up. In their bail letter to the judge, they write, quote, the evidence against the defendant, which would be made public at trial, includes substantial evidence that is highly sensitive and has the potential to significantly and negatively impact the defendant's reputation. For example, dozens of video recordings created by the defendant of freak-offs with victims. I mean, we wondered what was collected by federal authorities after they raided Combs' homes in LA and Miami back in March. There were reports that they collected digital evidence. In fact, further on in the government's letter, prosecutors write, quote, setting aside devices seized in connection with the defendant's arrest, the government has obtained over 90 cell phones, laptops, cloud storage accounts, as well as over 30 other electronic and storage devices such as hard drives, thumb drives, cameras, and a surveillance system. The government also wrote, victim testimony regarding freak-offs is at times corroborated by other witness testimony, communications with the defendant and commercial sex workers, travel records, hotel records, videos of the freak-offs, and records reflecting or indicating payment. By the way, you're talking about evidence of freak-offs. Prosecutors revealed one other way that they can prove that these freak-off events happen, because in the government's bail letter, it states, the defendant arranged freak-offs with the assistance of members and associates of the enterprise, including employees of his business, and the hotel rooms where they were staged often sustained significant damages. So the prosecution's letter goes on to state that, for example, in approximately 2012 in Manhattan, the defendant paid over $46,000 to cover damages to a penthouse hotel room following a freak-off. Yeah. Now, I imagine the government plans to produce receipts of this, some documentation or witness testimony to corroborate that account, because it'll be tough for the defense to say, why else did that hotel room sustain allegedly $46,000 worth of damages if it wasn't for this wild sexual performance event? But again, you could see why the government's putting that evidence forward to suggest that these freak-offs occurred. Now, going back to that idea of consent, this defense of consent, I couple that with something else that I've been hearing. I've seen people say, why are these freak-offs a crime, right? You might be wild sexual encounters, but why is this sex trafficking? Why is this racketeering? Well, as laid out in the indictment, but also this was articulated by Damian Williams, the United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York. Here's what he had to say in a press conference after the unsealing of this indictment.
As alleged, Combs used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims to engage in extended sexual performances with male commercial sex workers, some of whom he transported or caused to be transported over state lines. When Combs didn't get his way, he was violent, and he subjected victims to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse so that they would participate in the freak-offs, and that Combs hit, kicked, threw objects at, and dragged victims, at times by their hair. On one occasion in March of 2016, that conduct was captured on video and later reported in the media. Specifically, Combs kicked, dragged, and threw a vase at a victim in a Los Angeles hotel when the victim was attempting to flee. As alleged, these assaults often resulted in injuries to the victims, which took days or weeks to heal. In addition to the violence, the indictment alleges that Combs threatened and coerced victims to get them to participate in the freak-offs. He used the embarrassing and sensitive recordings he made of the freak-offs as collateral against the victims.
And that's the key. It's using power, violence, threats, coercion, force to get people to participate in sexual activity. That is illegal. Sex trafficking is when you use such methods for the purposes of commercial sex, usually over state lines. Commercial sex is when money is offered for sexual services or something else of value. And one of the things that the indictment mentions is how Combs would allegedly dangle promises of career opportunities or threatening to withhold financial support to get people to do what he wanted. Now, you heard Damian Williams mention that 2016 incident. So even if you hadn't been following the Combs legal saga for the past year, everyone saw that video that was published by CNN of Combs allegedly beating Cassandra Ventura back in 2016 at the Intercontinental Hotel in LA, all while wearing a robe. This is something that Ventura alleged had happened when she filed her lawsuit back in November of 2023. But when that video was released, we all saw with our own eyes what apparently transpired. And we know Sean Combs issued an apology on Instagram 2 days after the release of that tape. But how this ties to the freak-off? Well, the allegation was the reason he was in a towel, the reason she was allegedly running away, the reason he allegedly beat her was because she was trying to escape a freak-off. And as Ventura alleged, prosecutors say Combs tried to cover up this event. In the bail letter, prosecutors write, quote, "When a member of hotel security staff intervened, the defendant attempted to offer the hotel security officer a stack of cash to ensure his silence. After the security guard refused the defendant's bribe and after coordination between the defendant and his employees, the defendant's staff contacted other members of hotel security. At the same time, staff members were in close communication with the victim of the assault as well, all in an effort to cover up the defendant's assault and to prevent the incident from being publicly disclosed. Within days of the incident, the surveillance video disappeared from the hotel's server." By the way, that brings me to another point about the freak-offs. How many people allegedly helped Combs do this? As the indictment reads, quote, "Members and associates of the Combs enterprise, including high-ranking supervisors, security staff, household staff, personal assistants, and other Combs business employees, facilitated the freak-offs by, among other things, booking hotel rooms for the freak-offs, stocking the hotel rooms in advance with the required freak-off supplies, including controlled substances, baby oil, lubricant, extra linens, and lighting, cleaning the hotel rooms after the freak-offs to try to mitigate room damage, arranging for travel for victims, commercial sex workers, and Combs to and from freak-offs, resupplying Combs with requested supplies, delivering large sums of cash to Combs to pay the commercial sex workers, and scheduling the delivery of IV fluids." In or about March 2024, during searches of Combs' residences in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California, law enforcement seized various freak-off supplies, including narcotics, and more than 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant. Wow. So assuming the government did in fact collect all of this evidence, again, I don't think there's a great defense for why someone would have that much baby oil and lubricant, so the defense will probably be like, yeah, my client engaged in these sexual sessions, but hey, that's not illegal on its face. Everyone agreed to it. It's all consensual. But here's the larger point. First, you can see how this supports the racketeering conspiracy charge that Combs faces, right? The idea that there was an agreement to create and further a criminal enterprise. Combs can't do this alone. Prosecutors need to prove he conspired with others in this criminal enterprise to break the law. So you see this alleged coordination between multiple people at his behest. But this also helps explain potential witnesses that may be working with the government. Those people that used to work for Combs, associated with Combs, help facilitate these alleged freak-offs that may now be key witnesses at a future trial. After all, What did the prosecution write in their letter to the judge? The government has conducted interviews with over 50 victims and witnesses, many of whom saw or experienced the defendant's abuse. Many of these witnesses corroborate one another, and their accounts are similarly consistent with the other types of evidence discussed below. The government only expects that number to continue to grow, given that the investigation, which is now public, is ongoing. And we did another sidebar on the potential that people will come forward or take deals to cooperate with the government. You can check it out on our Law&Crime YouTube page. But if you thought that all of that wasn't shocking enough when it comes to the freak-offs, I want to leave you with one final allegation regarding these freak-offs.
He's not guilty. He's innocent of these charges. We know what the charges are going to be without seeing the indictment. It's going to be racketeering. It's going to be sex trafficking. It's going to be things along those lines. This is what we've been expecting since the search was in March. He, to his great credit, he voluntarily came to New York. Not a lot of defendants do that. He came to New York to basically engage the court system and start the case, and it'll start today. And he's going to plead not guilty, obviously. He's going to fight this with all of his energy and all of his might and the full confidence of his lawyers. And I expect a long battle with a good result for Mr. Combs.
Sean Combs' world seemed to start unraveling last November when his ex-girlfriend, Cassie Ventura, filed a civil suit against him, claiming she was sexually and physically abused by Combs for years. She basically said she was terrorized by him. Combs settled that suit the very next day. It was pretty stunning. Then came an avalanche of other lawsuits. And one thing that has often been mentioned are Combs' sex parties. They're called freak-offs. The U.S. attorney discussed the freak-offs in a press conference.
As alleged, Combs used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims to engage in extended sexual performances with male commercial sex workers, some of whom he transported or caused to be transported over state lines. Combs allegedly planned and controlled the sex performances, which he called freak-offs, and he often electronically recorded them. The freak-offs sometimes lasted days at a time, involved multiple commercial sex workers, and often involved a variety of narcotics, such as ketamine, ecstasy, and GHB, which Combs distributed to the victims to keep them obedient and compliant. As alleged, when Combs didn't get his way, he was violent, and he subjected victims to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse so that they would participate in the freak-offs, and that Combs hit, kicked, threw objects at, and dragged victims, at times by their hair.
The feds lay out in more detail how these freak-offs were organized in the indictment. Combs and other members and associates of the Combs enterprise wielded the power and prestige of Combs' role at the Combs business to intimidate, threaten, and lure female victims into Combs' orbit, often under the pretense of a romantic relationship. Combs then used force, threats of force, and coercion to cause victims to engage in extended sex acts with male commercial sex workers that Combs referred to as, among other things, freak-offs. Freak-offs were elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, masturbated during, and often electronically recorded. In arranging these freak-offs, Combs, with the assistance of members and associates of the Combs enterprise, transported and caused to be transported commercial sex workers across state lines and internationally. The U.S. attorney referenced one incident of someone being abused during a freak-off that sounded eerily familiar. Remember Combs' ex-girlfriend, Cassie Ventura, who I mentioned earlier, and that explosive video obtained by CNN that showed Combs chasing her down a hallway and stomping on her? Well, the U.S. attorney Damian Williams referenced an incident that sounded a lot like that incident at the hotel in Los Angeles in 2016 that involved Ventura.
On one occasion in March of 2016, that conduct was captured on video and later reported in the media. Specifically, Combs kicked, dragged, and threw a vase at a victim in a Los Angeles hotel when the victim was attempting to flee. As alleged, these assaults often resulted in injuries to the victims, which took days or weeks to heal. In addition to the violence, the indictment alleges that Combs threatened and coerced victims to get them to participate in the freak-offs. He used the embarrassing and sensitive recordings he made of the freak-offs as collateral against the victims. and the indictment alleges that he maintained control over the victims in several ways, including by giving them drugs, by giving and threatening to take away financial support or housing, by promising them career opportunities, by monitoring their whereabouts, and even by dictating their physical appearance. Because of all of this, the indictment alleges that the victims did not believe they could refuse Combs without risking their security or facing more abuse.
Now remember, Sean Combs may be the person facing the charges, but the feds are accusing him of using his business empire to run a criminal enterprise, and they say he wasn't doing this alone.
And Combs has been charged with RICO conspiracy. He used his business and employees of that business and other close associates to get his way.
The U.S. Attorney says those employees included high-ranking supervisors, security staff, household staff, personal assistants, and other Combs business employees. They facilitated the freak-offs, according to the indictment, by, among other things, booking hotel rooms for the freak-offs, stocking the hotel rooms in advance with the required freak-off supplies, including controlled substances, baby oil, lubricant, extra linens, and lighting, cleaning the hotel rooms after the freak-offs to try to mitigate room damage, arranging for travel for victims, commercial sex workers, and Combs to and from freak-offs, resupplying Combs with requested supplies, delivering large sums of cash to Combs to pay the commercial sex workers. And this next one is a bit shocking when you read it because it shows that these freak-offs, since they were alleged to have gone on for days, were physically grueling and taxing. The indictment says Combs's associates actually had IV fluids delivered for participants. It continues, in or about March 2024, during searches of Combs's residence in Miami, Florida, and Los Angeles, California, law enforcement seized various freak-off supplies, including narcotics and more than 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant. So federal prosecutors are saying Sean Combs had stockpiled lubricant and baby oil that was used in these freak-offs. A lot of this information started coming to light late last year when Cassie Ventura filed a lawsuit against Combs, which was remarkably settled the very next day, as I mentioned earlier. But more lawsuits followed with more allegations. And U.S. Attorney Damian Williams says Combs and his team tried to get those making the allegations to stay quiet.
And as the indictment alleges, in late 2023, after public allegations were made about Combs's crimes, he and others pressured witnesses and victims to stay silent, including by making phone calls to witnesses and victims and giving them a false narrative of what they had experienced. And as alleged, Combs used others to help conceal his abuse by monitoring and preventing victims from leaving a location in order to hide their injuries, or by locating and contacting a victim who had attempted to flee.
Combs had been in New York for several days anticipating the indictment. News Nation obtained exclusive video of him talking with his attorney and one of his sons in a park over the weekend. But the feds swooped in Monday night and took him into custody. He's officially charged with 3 counts: racketeering conspiracy, sex trafficking by force, fraud, or coercion, and transportation to engage in prostitution.
First, this office is determined to investigate and prosecute anyone who engages in sex trafficking, no matter how powerful or wealthy or famous you may be. No one should doubt our commitment on that. A year ago, Sean Combs stood in Times Square and was handed a key to New York City. Today, he's been indicted and will face justice in the Southern District of New York. Second, we are not done. This investigation is ongoing, and I encourage anyone with information about this case to come forward and to do it quickly. Anyone with information can call 1-877-4-HSI-TIP.
According to the indictment against Diddy, investigators seized more than 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant from his home. The court doc states these items were used in something referred to as freak-offs, which were elaborate and produced sex performances that Combs arranged, directed, masturbated during, and often electronically recorded. In arranging these freak-offs, Combs, with the assistance of members and associates of the Combs enterprise, transported and caused to be transported commercial sex workers across state lines and internationally. During freak-offs, Combs distributed a variety of controlled substances to victims, in part to keep the victims obedient and compliant. Sometimes, unbeknownst to the victims, Combs kept videos he filmed of victims engaging in sex acts with commercial sex workers. After freak-offs, Combs and the victims typically received IV fluids to recover from the physical exertion and drug use. So Diddy's business employees allegedly facilitated these freak-offs by stocking the hotel rooms in advance with the required freak-off supplies, including controlled substances, baby oil, lubricant, extra linens, and lighting, cleaning the hotel rooms after the freak-offs to try to mitigate room damage, arranging for travel for victims, commercial sex workers, and Combs to and from freak-offs, resupplying Combs with the requested supplies, delivering large sums of cash to Combs to pay the commercial sex workers, and scheduling the delivery of IV fluids. So these items were collected during the federal raids, including narcotics and hundreds of bottles of lube and baby oil. There were also electronic files of these freak-offs, and the feds collected those too. In addition to all this, investigators seized AR-15 guns, ammunition, and a large-capacity drum magazine from Diddy's home. Since those raids in March, federal prosecutors have been crafting their case against Diddy, which led to grand jury proceedings against him. So he was indicted on Monday and taken into custody, and on Tuesday, that indictment was unsealed. Also on Tuesday, Diddy appeared in federal court where he pleaded not guilty to the charges against him. During the hearing, Diddy was also denied bail, a federal judge ruling he must remain in custody until trial. With all that in mind, let's take a closer look at what exactly the feds collected from Diddy's homes. For that, we turn to former CIA officer and FBI agent Tracy Walder. This indictment that just came down, I know we were kind of expecting it to happen, but when it did, what were your thoughts?
Yeah, I had expected, I'd said before that I thought we'd get an indictment within 6 to 9 months. People weren't happy with me because they thought that was just too long. But it was almost exactly 6 months, actually, since the warrants were served on both of his homes. I think it's not a surprise to me because I'm glad he's being charged with this. I wholeheartedly thought that he would have a RICO, a racketeering charge. I knew that would be something that they would get him on. I was concerned that they wouldn't get him on human trafficking because sometimes that can be really difficult to prove. And I just always worry that those cases fall through the cracks and then justice isn't served for the victims. And so I was pleased to see that he was charged with that, so that hopefully he could be held accountable.
Much of the evidence that the prosecution now has against Diddy came from the federal raids. Talking about a federal search warrant, what does that look like, just generically?
Right. So in this case, and I don't recall if I talked to you about this or maybe Jesse, but when that warrant was served back in March, the question is if they served the warrant, why can't they just arrest him? And again, as you mentioned, they probably didn't have enough evidence at that time to do so. However, to get a warrant like that, where it's served simultaneously and, in a surprising manner, they really had to prove one of two things. The first being that evidence was imminently going to be destroyed, or that the lives of people were in danger. I believe that it was the former that they were probably able to prove, is that evidence may have been going to be destroyed. And that's why they served the warrants. And that's why they were able to serve the warrants, to preserve that evidence.
I feel like a lot of us who don't have experience in the FBI or CIA, we just picture movies or TV shows when you see people come in and opening drawers and closets and going through everything. But what does it really look like when they're there on the ground serving these federal warrants?
Yeah, I mean, in a case like this, obviously you're not making any kind of a dynamic entry. This isn't a hostage situation, right? Where that's not what's happening here. However, they did know that there would be weapons there, armed security, those kinds of things. That's why you saw those warrants being served by, for the most part, a tactical SWAT team. Simply, that is procedure to keep everyone safe. A lot of people were frustrated when they saw the video that came out of the warrant, that his home was, in, I guess, disarray. But again, and I had said this before, my gut said they were looking for digital evidence, which is in that indictment. There's a lot of mentions to digital evidence. And that's why they tore up couch cushions. That's why they made holes in walls. They were looking for flash drives, tiny devices where these things were stored. And so all of that is done methodically. It's all cataloged. And in a case like this, where you're not necessarily rushing, to put out a fire or something like that, it was all done in a very methodical way. You typically go through room by room to catalog all of that evidence.
Taking a closer look at all that evidence, Diddy had 3 AR-15s seized during the federal raids that had been defaced. What do you think that would look like, though? Because weapons obviously are very dangerous. We don't want them to go off. How is that collected?
Well, they typically clear the weapon, right? They're going to go ahead and take the cartridge out of it and make sure that there are no rounds, obviously, in the chamber, and then disassemble it to be taken back as evidence. What's interesting is the AR-15s that they found. Some people have AR-15s. It's legal in some places, but they found that the serial number was scraped off of them, and that I thought was interesting because I don't know if Diddy didn't want those traceable to him, or if he had received them on the black market.
You know what's interesting is that we just recently, in the second attempted assassination of former President Donald Trump, we saw those federal charges for tampering with the weapon, where he, the alleged attempted assassin, scraped off or made not legible the serial number. So why is it that Diddy might not have received charges like that?
So in terms of Mr. Ralph, that's the individual currently charged. And that, I believe those are just simply placeholder charges, if you want me to be honest with you. I don't think they're really going to move forward with those. I think they're going to go with much larger charges, but they haven't had the element of time, right, that they've had with Diddy. They arrested him immediately after, 45 minutes after this attempt. And so they did what they could with what they had at that particular moment in time to keep him in custody. And so I think that's why you didn't see those with Diddy. These are much larger charges with Diddy. They don't need those kind of placeholder charges to keep him in jail until they can get more. So that's why I think you don't see those.
As far as the AR-15s, ammunition, I know that they mentioned a drum magazine as well. Where are those stored now? Where does all of that go?
An evidence locker of some sort, I'm assuming to the FBI. The FBI, their local office, will have an evidence locker that takes in all of that, catalogs it, and keeps it together basically on a case-by-case basis. It's all labeled based on a case.
Another thing that was collected during all of this is narcotics. So there are illegal drugs like meth and also prescription drugs too. I'm wondering if federal investigators are going to look and track down who provided these to Diddy. Where was the source for these prescription or other street drugs that were in the homes?
I think that that's a possibility, especially based on what we saw with Matthew Perry and the ketamine queen and the doctors and all the other, I think, 5 individuals who were ultimately charged in that. They may be going on different sort of avenues in terms of charging. I don't think they're done in terms of charging. And I do think with this recent crackdown on this, that they very well may go after those individuals, whomever the suppliers were.
Another thing that everyone seems to be talking about from this indictment is the 1,000 bottles of baby oil and personal lubricant that were collected between Diddy's 2 homes. This one really stood out to me. I guess, what do you just make of that?
I don't know a way to say this. Based on what was in the indictment regarding these freak offs that's what they call them in here. I think that's what Diddy called them, quite frankly. The severity at which they were, the length and duration at which they were, I'm actually not surprised that that's what was collected ultimately from his home. It's absolutely horrific. The fact that some of these victims needed IV rehydration afterwards, couldn't go out because they were so injured as a result of this. It's absolutely horrific. And now, based on what we've learned of the magnitude of those freak-offs, it's unfortunately not surprising.
What would it look like for investigators to go through and, I guess, document everything that they have as far as the electronic evidence while maintaining the anonymity of the survivors, I guess?
Right. And I think that's why in the indictment, you really don't hear much mention of victims. If, for those who have read it, there's victim 1 that is mentioned in it, but there are no names that are mentioned. And I believe that that's done on purpose. The prosecution wants to have a rapport with these victims to continue to get information from them. And we don't want to re-victimize them. No one deserves that. And so I think doing this in an anonymous way is what we should be doing with these victims. But I think part of the issue, part of what took some time actually in terms of going through all of this, as you mentioned, there was video evidence of these freak-offs. You have to go through now and identify everyone who is in those videos. And that really can take some time. It's a very tedious task. I don't know that they were able to identify every single person that appeared in these videos, but I am certain that they were able to identify some of them. And those are the interviews that they did. And that's what ultimately led to an indictment.
These are some of the major things that people are talking about because they were mentioned in the indictment. But is it possible that the feds collected even more information that we don't know about yet? It may come out at trial.
100%. I'm certain of it. I think someone said, oh, this is a big indictment, 14 pages. In my opinion, it's actually not that big. I've seen bigger indictments, which in my opinion also leads me to believe that all of the evidence is not included in it. And they're entitled to do that. If you actually look at the Brian Kohberger case, they didn't include all the evidence in the indictment. Yes, it needs to be handed over to the defense, obviously, but it doesn't need to necessarily be in the indictment. You only need to put in the information that led to it. And so my guess is they have more. They just didn't put it all in there.
Then there's the time frame to consider, from the raids in March all the way to the grand jury and indictment in September. So that's 6 months of prosecutors gathering evidence, investigators going through it, you said methodically, making sure that they have all their ducks in a row, so to speak. What would that part of it actually look like? Would they highlight or flag something that they thought would bolster the prosecution's case when they came across it?
I've never thought about it from, the prosecution and defense point of view. I just thought about it from the FBI agent point of view because obviously our biggest thing is making sure that we collect the evidence properly, log it properly, and process it properly, because if we don't, it cannot be used by the prosecution or by the defense. So then that is problematic. Also, the biggest thing, if you are looking at bringing someone up on charges, particularly federal ones, the reality is we want to make sure we almost have overabundance of evidence to almost over convict the individual. And so I think that's, from an FBI perspective, what they were working on.
On top of Diddy's 3 federal charges, Tracy says other charges could be on the way.
Yeah, I think one of the things in reading the indictment, this is all on video, right? A lot of this is on video. And I would be interested to see if other people are going to be charged. I know they talked about the fact that people procured some of these individuals for them and drugs and all of that. And so I would be interested to know if any of those people will face charges at some point. I don't know the answer to that, but I think that these victims deserve that, quite frankly, because of what was done to them. So I'll be interested to see if more charges come out against some of the individuals who facilitated this.
It's alleged Diddy would pay to fly male sex workers to his location, which included cities in the United States, and he would require Cassie and his staff to help him make these arrangements. According to the federal indictment against him, when the federal agents searched through his homes during the raids, they seized drugs and more than 1,000 bottles of baby oil and lubricant. In Cassie's suit, she alleged Diddy's assistant, who also set up the freak-offs, would stock the hotel suites with baby oil and Astroglide. And Diddy always supplied her and the sex workers with copious amount of drugs like ecstasy, cocaine, GHB, and ketamine. According to her suit, she would frequently get anxious before the FOs to the point she would become physically ill. But still, Diddy would shame her into performing for him, and if she didn't want to participate, she was met with anger and violence. In Rodney Jones Jr.'s civil racketeering lawsuit first filed in February of this year, he alleged Diddy had a habit of regularly drugging his party guests and having forced sex with men and women. Like the federal indictment laid out, Diddy didn't work alone. He always had a team helping him with his alleged crimes. Jones, who was also once in Diddy's inner circle, alleged in his lawsuit he was required to solicit sex workers and perform sex acts with them for Diddy's pleasure. Adult film star Adria English, who filed her suit against Diddy in July of this year, alleged she was groomed into sex trafficking over time by Diddy. In her suit, she said she first met Diddy around 2004, when her boyfriend at the time was auditioning for a modeling gig at Diddy's fashion line, Sean John. She claims her boyfriend and another model were asked to perform oral sex on Diddy in order to get the job, and when he refused, Diddy's associate offered him the job as long as Adria worked as a go-go dancer at his white party in the Hamptons. She says at his party, she regularly had to drink alcohol laced with drugs like ecstasy. According to her suit, Diddy demanded she have sex with party guests. And if she didn't, he would tank her career and blackball her and her boyfriend from the industry if they didn't comply. Diddy's most recent accuser, singer Dawn Richard from Danity Kane, alleged in her lawsuit filed about a week before her former boss's arrest that at an after-party she saw a copious amount of illegal drugs, and the girls who attended the parties appeared lethargic or passed out while Diddy and his guests allegedly performed sexual acts on them. She alleged in her suit Diddy told party guests, "This is a buffet, enjoy yourselves. This is what we do. This is how we party." Under Diddy's federal indictment, it alleges the producer threatened and coerced women and others around him to fulfill his sexual desires for years. When federal prosecutors announced the unsealing of the federal indictment against him, U.S. Attorney Damian Williams said the victims were filled with drugs to control them for long periods of time, with participants of the freak-offs typically having to get IV fluids to recover from the physical exertion.
The freak-offs sometimes lasted days at a time, involved multiple commercial sex workers, and often involved a variety of narcotics, such as ketamine, ecstasy, and GHB, which Combs distributed to the victims to keep them obedient and compliant. As alleged, when Combs didn't get his way, he was violent, and subjected victims to physical, emotional, and verbal abuse so that they would participate in the freak-offs, and that Combs hit, kicked, threw objects at, and dragged victims, at times by their hair.
While arguing for bail after he was arraigned, Diddy's attorney reportedly told the judge it's not sex trafficking if the participants of the freak-offs wanted to be there. After Diddy was denied bail on Tuesday by a federal judge, his attorney, seemingly disappointed Diddy wasn't issued bail, said he'll continue to fight for his client.
So this was the first step. We have a bail appeal scheduled for tomorrow at 3:30 in front of Judge Carter, the district judge assigned to this case. I think that we made the points that we've been wanting to make. I think he came out. Mr. Combs is a fighter. He's going to fight this to the end. He's innocent. He came to New York to establish his innocence. He's not afraid. He's not afraid of the charges. There's nothing that the government said in their presentation today that changes anyone's mind about anything. He's been looking forward to this day. He's been looking forward to clearing his name, and he's going to clear his name. And we're going to stand by his side as he does. We believe in him wholeheartedly. He didn't do these things. This was a 10-year relationship. There's no coercion. There's no crime. There's basically just, someone who brought a civil case and now is finding themselves as a witness in a criminal case. And we're going to fight this case with everything we have, as is he. And eventually he's going to be shown to be innocent. And so tomorrow we fight again, and we'll fight every day until we don't have to fight anymore.
Now the once beloved, but also to some feared music mogul, will have to wait to eventually face his fate in federal court. I'm joined now by a really great guest, and that's the state attorney for Palm Beach County, Dave Ehrenberg. Dave, thank you so much for joining me today. Now, Sean Combs, aka Diddy's arrest this week, has made headlines essentially across the globe as he's facing now these federal charges in the sex trafficking case in the Southern District of New York. And his so-called freak-offs are at the center of the prosecution's case. What are your thoughts?
Well, first, it's good to be back with you, Elizabeth. The allegations are horrifying. And my first thought was, how did these things happen for so long with so many people involved and no one seemed to tip off authorities? I mean, according to the indictment, these were highly orchestrated performances of sexual activity in hotels and other locations with drugs. They would go on for days. There were cases of baby oil brought in. There were IVs given allegedly to the victims to recover from the physical exertion and drug use. Were there doctors involved? Who else knew about this? What about the hotel workers? What about all the participants? And only until Cassie finally spoke up did this thing start to unravel. And kudos to Cassie. And my other reaction was, it shows you that people can make a difference in this. And one person speaking up can make a difference. It also shows you how laws can make a difference. The reason why Cassie spoke up was because the New York legislature passed a law that extended the statute of limitations for sexual assault cases civilly to create a new 1-year period that allowed victims to sue their alleged perpetrators even after the statute of limitations was long past. That's what allowed Cassie to come up with her lawsuit, file it, and that's what set all this in motion.
And reading through the many civil lawsuits that Diddy was already facing and comparing it to the indictment, you can't help but see a pattern of alleged abuse. Many of his accusers, even outside of Cassie, have alleged Diddy has drug/laced them, sexually assaulted or raped them at these parties. Now that Diddy has been arrested, could their claims in the civil lawsuits be used against him in the federal case?
Well, yeah, expect to see them testify in the federal case. Now, there's a different standard in civil and federal. In criminal law, we have to prove cases in criminal law beyond a reasonable doubt. In civil cases, just a preponderance of the evidence. And there's looser evidentiary rules in civil cases than there are in criminal cases. But do expect to see those complaints that were made civilly to come back against him criminally, because when you allege something in a sworn pleading that something happened, yeah, that can come back in a criminal proceeding against Diddy as long as the statute of limitations has not expired. And in this case, you have this pattern alleged of racketeering activity, of sex trafficking, things that could put him in prison for the rest of his life. And so key to this will be the victims and the witnesses taking the stand if it ever goes that far. Now, for Diddy's sake, he's the big fish here, but I'm sure there are other big name individuals who were involved in this, who attended the parties and partook in this, and he may want to start singing because that may be his best chance to avoid the rest of his life behind bars.
And one of his accusers, Rodney Jones Jr., the producer who sued Diddy earlier this year, he claimed he was required to solicit sex workers for these parties. He said many in Diddy's camp were also required to do this. Does that automatically qualify as sex trafficking if they're recruiting these women, potentially even men, for these parties? And what does that tell you about the people in Diddy's inner circle and some of the requirements they had to do in a way to kind of meet his needs?
If women were recruited in the parties to have sex with other people in exchange for money, then that would be human trafficking if they were underage, the women, or if they were adults, if they engaged in this with force, fraud, and coercion, meaning that you'd have to prove for sex trafficking, if there was an adult victim, that there was force, fraud, or coercion. Otherwise, it's prostitution, and prostitution would not be just prosecuted at the federal level. It would be mainly a state crime, but the feds are looking at sex trafficking, which can get you up to life in prison. And the sex trafficking is really a serious crime that involves a commercial sex trade. But again, for an adult victim, you have to have force, fraud, or coercion. And that is what is being alleged here. You can coerce people into having sex with others, or if you drug them up to make them have sex with others, that would be enough to charge someone with sex trafficking.
And yesterday in court, Diddy's attorney made kind of an interesting argument. He said, is it sex trafficking if everyone wants to be at the freak-offs and wanted to be there? And the defense reportedly went on to say they don't want the federal government in their bedroom. What do you make of that argument? And do you believe that this is a case about just sex?
Well, that's why the judge denied bond. That's why the judge denied the defense request to let him out pre-trial in exchange for a $50 million bond, because he said that the alleged crimes here occurred behind closed doors. So the judge did not believe it was consensual. The judge believed you are hiding stuff behind these closed doors, and we cannot trust you to be alone with these people or to be alone with anyone, because you could do it again. And as far as whether consent is a defense to sex trafficking, well, it is if there's no force, fraud, or coercion. If everyone engages in commercial sex work voluntarily, without force, fraud, or coercion, then you could have prostitution charges, but that would be state charges. Here, the sex trafficking is because of the allegations that people were forced into it, or they were drugged into it against their will. So that's where the allegations come from. That's where the charges come from.
And just a few months ago, Diddy's friend, Stevie J, aka Stephen Jordan, he posted a video to his social media page after all the civil lawsuits with the caption, "This is what a real Diddy party looks like." It showed very high profile celebrities there. Do you think that these swanky parties that Diddy had were just kind of a mask of what could come after, essentially during these after parties or during these so-called freak offs? What do you kind of make of just Diddy's infamous parties that he's been so well known for before?
I remember watching South Park, and they had a whole episode about the devil trying to compete with one of Diddy's parties. Diddy did it. That was the phrase that they kept using. And back then it was kind of humorous because of his lavish parties. But there's clearly a sinister side to these parties, according to the allegations, that they involve forced sex and drugs, and then using IVs to bring people back who were overly drugged and treated in such a way where they were physically totally exhausted by doing things that they were forced to do. I mean, it just sounds horrific. I mean, the cases of baby oil being brought in, it's something that makes me wonder how many people knew what was going on. Big parties are one thing, but when you start forcing people to do things against their will, and then you allegedly try to blackmail them so that they're forced to do it by saying, we're going to show videos of you, we're going to extort you into having our way with you, or else we're going to expose your deepest, darkest secrets. That's a crime. And that's something that no one should be partaking in. And that's where perhaps some other big names will start to be revealed if they actually partook in this. Because what you saw here is a series of crimes, not just fun parties, but crimes.
And that also brings me to my next question. Do the celebrities and the others who have attended his parties need to be worried right now?
Absolutely. If a celebrity attended a big party and just hung out at the buffet table, that's one thing. But if you go into the other wing of the party where all the sex trafficking was occurring, yeah, you got problems. And, their defense may be, I didn't know. Well, you can't stick your head in the sand and just say, you're innocent. At some point, you have to be responsible for your actions. And so I've heard some rumors of some big names being involved. Not going to mention it because I don't have any proof, but it will come out if there's evidence that these celebrities partook in the horrors of the parties. So we'll see soon enough.
And are you surprised Diddy isn't facing any type of cyber charges, given he allegedly filmed and kept recordings of these encounters at the so-called freak-offs?
There could always be a superseding indictment, whereas the evidence comes in, they could charge him with other crimes. But right now, the crimes they're charging him with would keep him behind bars for the rest of his life. And so the feds may not think there's a need to do an amended indictment yet. Now, that could come. But I thought perhaps there'd be some federal firearms charges, because I thought there were reports when they raided Diddy's places that there were people there with guns, and the feds take that very seriously if they're violating federal firearm laws. I mean, look at the assassination attempt against Donald Trump. You see the gun laws were the first ones to be filed. So perhaps that's coming, or perhaps they don't have enough evidence there. But generally, when the feds raid your place, come in, guns ablazing, someone's going down. Someone's going to get indicted.
And how hard is it to try a sex trafficking case? Given Diddy's enormous amount of power he had in Hollywood before, do you see there being any trouble with witnesses coming forward, even though Diddy is now behind bars?
I think the fact that Diddy does not have pretrial release, that he is behind bars, will encourage victims to come forward, knowing that they'll be protected, especially as the evidence mounts. All it takes is one to start, and Cassie was that one. And then you have others who followed. So there's safety in numbers, and I do think you'll see people testifying. And as far as how hard it is to prove sex trafficking, well, you have to prove it's a commercial sex act and that there was force, fraud, and coercion, or coercion. And that's what you need. It's a serious crime, and even if that can't be proven, there are racketeering charges involving other crimes. So there's other charges, and there could be more if there's a superseding indictment. But this is not looking good for Diddy right now, and that's why I'm thinking that perhaps his best defense may be to try to tell the feds about all the other people who were involved in this.
And, I was down at the courthouse just yesterday, and what I found kind of interesting in all of this was kind of how confident the defense seems to be throughout all of this case. I mean, now Diddy, who once was known to be untouchable in a way, now he is behind bars in a federal prison in Brooklyn. But are you surprised that the defense is coming off as confident as they are? I think they were kind of surprised that Diddy wasn't released on bail yesterday.
These are highly paid, highly powerful, and highly successful lawyers, and they want to give off the aura of confidence. You don't get to be where they are by running scared. Now, I do think they were surprised that an offer of a $50 million bond, an offer of lots of restrictions, home arrest, would be rejected. But the court did what the court needed to do, because Diddy is allegedly a danger to the community and a flight risk for that matter, because he's got so much money. So I think the court made the right decision in denying bond.
And when it comes to the impeding trial that we don't know when it's going to happen yet, but when it comes to the trial in this case, what type of defense do you see them exploring for trial?
I think the defense has already been telegraphed. I think they'll say this was a consensual party. These were consensual acts. And if it was prostitution, those are just minor state charges, that there was not sex trafficking, that this was not an ongoing criminal enterprise of racketeering, that this is a music business with lots of wild parties, and he should be able to live the life he wants to live with people who are engaging in consensual activities. Now, whether a jury will buy that, I mean, it's belied by the evidence. The evidence has shown that there was some coercion, some forced conduct, some blackmail. And, all it takes is one witness to take the stand and say what she or he went through. And I think that's going to be very powerful evidence, because I don't think Diddy is going to take the stand here if it goes to trial. And Cassie, I think, could be a very powerful witness. And apparently there are others ready to go.
All right. Well, Dave Ehrenberg, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate it. Before we sign you off, anything else about this case that you'd like to add?
I think it shows that no one is above the law. A lot of people thought that Diddy would escape this because of his wealth and his power and his prestige. No one is untouchable. And I think that it shows that if there's evidence, prosecutors will follow it and do the right thing.
About the parties, Diddy told Oprah in 2006, quote, "I wanted to strip away everyone's image and put us all in the same color, on the same level." So all the high-profile guests were required to wear all white as party attire. Kids were invited to the parties too, but only for a while. Their parents were allegedly given a 1-hour warning for when the kids would be required to leave and the real party would begin. There's allegations that at this adult portion of the party, there were illegal drugs like cocaine and ecstasy, sex workers, and other illegal activity. The parties were mainly hosted at Diddy's 4,500 square foot mansion in the Hamptons. To give you an idea of the home, he sold it in 2020 for $4.7 million. Later, Diddy moved the party to Beverly Hills and even co-hosted it with Ashton Kutcher. The last white party was held in 2009. But now, more than a decade later, there are questions about the illegal activity there and whether these high-profile guests knew anything about it. And for that, we turn to entertainment attorney Mitra Horian. We're looking back at all the allegations against Diddy, and he was in the public eye for many, many years. One of the main things that people knew him from, obviously rapping, but also he threw these elaborate parties, the white parties. Can you explain to me a bit about what they were?
Yeah, the white parties were famous. I was not a lawyer at the time. And so I didn't work in entertainment, I guess is the point. I wasn't an entertainment lawyer. But we knew about them growing up. And so they were sort of famous. They were kind of like, how everyone knows about the Playboy parties. Diddy's white parties were very famous. So there, I think that there's a certain group of people that would go just because he was a celebrity and they were excited to get an invitation. And it was kind of this, cool crowd to be in. And the parties were famous. So, of course, people wanted to be there. And, on the other side, I think there was another group of people that probably were more in his inner circle and may have seen things that sort of the casual partygoer may not have seen.
Talking about the celebrity aspect of all this, I mean, I remember reading probably Us Weekly or In Touch and seeing photos of these celebrities at his parties. Some were as high profile as Leonardo DiCaprio or Sarah Jessica Parker, Paris Hilton, a lot of these huge names. So now, 20 years later, 10 years later, their names are circulating once again. What's going on in their mind? Are they trying to maybe distance themselves from these parties or Diddy?
I think everyone's being quiet until they know, more about what's going on. I think in this climate, there's always a nervousness around, okay, how are facts going to come out and how are they going to be potentially manipulated? And I also think we're kind of in a place as the public where we want to tear things apart. We want to look, call out misbehavior. But I also think, in fairness, just because you were at a party doesn't mean you necessarily condone what was going on there. A lot of people can find themselves at parties, and I think a lot of celebrities have, found themselves interacting with people that they may have later discovered were problematic, or even just, even developing friendships. People are able to sort of hide certain aspects of their friendships if they're not really deep friendships. So it'll be interesting to see who is actually linked into some of this, the goings on that are really the subject of the indictment and the criminal charges. And then the people that are sort of ancillary to it that happen to be there. That's a lot of people to be accusing of participating in this sort of behavior.
I think from the outside, someone who isn't really in the celebrity world, a lot of people just assume that illegal activity sometimes goes hand in hand. Maybe illegal drugs or things like that are more accessible to these celebrities because of their connections and their money. And a lot of people are saying that there was illegal activity at these parties. But again, they were 10 years ago, maybe more. Could any of that affect his charges now?
I mean, I think it depends on what kind of illegal activity we're talking about, right? So, first of all, in that era, for example, in California, marijuana was illegal. It is now no longer illegal. So, I think people wouldn't necessarily bat an eye if you said there was a lot of marijuana there, right? But there is, I think unquestionably in parties in Hollywood, at least, and the white parties were in the Hamptons as well. Those sort of, parties are kind of, you're going to expect to see certain things that you wouldn't necessarily expect to see going to dinner at your friend's house. It is a party environment. And I think the drugs are going to be there, the alcohol is going to be there. That could lead to other things. But the level of accusations here, what we're hearing in really graphic detail, rises to a level that nobody would accept or expect, I think, um, on such a large scale. So I think that it's you might expect to see some drugs or some sexual activity, but I don't think you're expecting to witness things like rape if the allegations are true, weapons if those allegations are true. There are things that rise above the types of things that you expect to see at a party, even a Hollywood party.
So we've talked about this. These are very high profile parties that me as a child living in Wisconsin even knew about. I mean, all over the country, we had heard about these parties. And according to some reports, there were as many as 1,000 people who were there. So I'm wondering if there was this illegal activity, these sex workers or rape, drugging people or guns, why was none of that reported back when the party took place?
It's first of all, celebrities, we can't get around the fact that they are treated differently. Historically, under the law, there's certain things that obviously, we have to enforce regardless of who it is. But there are some things that sort of fly under the radar. And, it's somebody's home. Right. So these are things that are happening in a home. And when you have 1,000 people and it's getting out of hand and everyone's, that's a part of it is getting paid very well to do their job. I think that, there are certain things that people kind of let go. But again, it's in a home. It's in a very large home. I guess we should call it a mansion. Let's not call it a home. And, in a home that's like, 20,000 square feet, I'm not sure the square footage, but I'm going to guess it's at least 20,000 square feet. And a lot of the parties are happening, also outside. The weather's nice. So when you have a home that big, you can't possibly, not everyone's going to all parts of the home. Not everyone's going to be seeing everything. There's a lot of people that are just happy to be there. And you mentioned 1,000 people cannot possibly have witnessed some of the activity that we're talking about.
I think when the indictment came down, a lot of people were kind of drawn to the description of these so-called freak-offs because the allegations are just so shocking. The fact that they even had this name, they're freak-offs, then we hear more about the IVs that people were required to use afterward because of the exertion, just so many things going on here with these alleged freak-offs. And now I'm wondering, is it possible that some of these happened at any of the white parties?
I think it's certainly possible. I think they could have happened anywhere. And if they were happening often enough, then it's certainly possible that they were happening in an environment where people were partying. And, the sex is sometimes part of a partying, and things get, if you are in an environment with people who have a tendency to doing those kinds of things, then certainly, and maybe that's something, after hours, not when, everyone's there. It could be something that's happening when the party sort of winds down and starts up in another way. But like you said, this level of behavior, this shocking level of behavior, and kind of the weirdness of it all with IVs and the things that are coming out is not something of someone that is mentally well. So I think that's what's shocking about it is like we might, forgive or dismiss a certain level of wildness with our celebrities, but this is mental illness if it happened.
Talking about celebrities, I know a lot of people are thinking about the high profile A-list people who were at the parties, and we all are wondering, were they partaking in any of this? Did they know about it? Anything like that? So, do you think that investigators, federal investigators going through with this indictment, now prosecutors are charging him, do you think that they would reach out to any of these celebrities that were at the parties? Perhaps Leonardo DiCaprio, Matthew Broderick, whoever it was, to hear more about what happened there?
I think they're not going to be just contacting celebrities willy-nilly. I think there's going to be some sort of indication, right, that person knows something or witnessed something. I think the focus is very much on bringing Diddy down right now. So if people are called in, they will be subpoenaed to as witnesses. I think the most important thing right now is witnesses and not necessarily bringing other charges. And again, if somebody, it's one thing to speak out in public, which celebrities have not really done. And it's another thing to be forced to testify in federal court. And I think we're going to be seeing a lot of that.
Let's say somebody did see something. They're speaking with investigators, they're subpoenaed, like you said. Is it possible that they then would testify when it comes time for the trial?
They would have to testify, right? So if they are compelled, they will have to testify. Now, remember, we have a Fifth Amendment right not to incriminate ourselves. So there's a way around certain questions that may arguably allow for, that right to be exerted. And I think even, the possibility of witnessing something and then that could potentially be incriminating, like a participation or allowing, without reporting these things. And I think that, there's going to be a little bit of a fine line when you talk about witnessing when it comes to the Fifth Amendment.
You also spoke about how not many celebrities have really addressed this Diddy situation. A lot of them were close friends with Diddy, but ever since the allegations and now indictment, we haven't heard much from them. Why is it, do you think, that they're keeping quiet?
I think that people are, first of all, scared. It is very common to be taken down if affiliated at all with individuals that are known for this kind of behavior, this criminal activity. There's a very real fear of criminal charges, but then there's also the other aspect of it, which is people's careers and livelihoods. And maybe some of it is, some people just don't know enough. And I think the interesting part of this was, the original, the origins of all of this was so long ago. We're talking decades. Like most of the celebrities that were around him was, when he was really at his height in the 90s, right? So 90s, early 2000s, I would say. So when you have like, that's really when most people were sort of associated with him. Why would they speak out? Maybe they don't even have any interaction with him now.
Talking about damage control too, because as you said, the public is so eager to take down celebrities, and this is part of their livelihood, is maintaining their image. Do you think that if they were to come out and speak, they'd have to do some sort of damage control, basically saying, we're distancing ourselves from Diddy, we don't have anything to do with that, things like that?
That could definitely be a statement that's made, but I think, there's an interesting aspect to this, with some rumors that Diddy's also historically been violent, and some evidence of that obviously coming out, right? And so there's a real fear. There's also these rumors that have been floating around for years and years about, killings, and they're like, these are real fears. So, luckily he's in custody right now, but that does not mean his reach does not extend beyond the four walls of that prison. It's a very powerful man, with, close to $1 billion net worth. And the fear of some sort of retaliation when there have been rumors of this type of retaliation. And if you look at historically, these decades of people who are afraid to even speak out at seeing this, absolutely shocking type of criminal activity, and there have been many people who have stayed silent on it, then when it's actually coming out in detail to the public, of course they're going to want to stay silent about it. There is a real fear there.
As of right now, he's innocent until proven guilty. He's pleaded not guilty. So we have to kind of go off that to start. Let's say he is acquitted and cleared of all of these charges. Do you think that his image, his public persona, could ever bounce back from these allegations?
Never. If he is acquitted, which I think is very unlikely, I think he will be acquitted because of, something in the law that allows him to sort of, get away with it, so to speak. And I say that really loosely with the understanding that, of course, he is innocent until proven guilty. However, there are so many people that, quote unquote, know about Diddy that although the details of it are really shocking, I think there's also an element of like kind of not surprised. I'm surprised at, some of the details of it, but there's many people who are like, yeah, everyone knew that about him. I was at the Cannes Film Festival in May of this year. Happened to have dinner, and next to a woman, was sitting at a separate table, and we started having a conversation, and that was kind of when a lot of the stuff about Diddy was coming out. And she was talking about how she was roommates, and I think I can say this because she speaks about it publicly, and I was a stranger next door to her, or sitting next to her, but she was the roommate of his girlfriend in college. They went to college together, and she's like, he used to beat her. We all knew he has been a woman beater. Again, hearsay, because I'm hearing it from somebody who says they were there. But I think there's enough people who have witnessed, and of course we've seen videos that are very graphic and very disturbing. So, I can't see any way that he would get away with it. Maybe, there's something where he can get around the trafficking and the interstate aspects of it. But I think it's going to be so challenging.
After his arrest, Diddy pleaded not guilty to federal charges. A statement from his legal team reads, quote, Sean Diddy Combs is a music icon, self-made entrepreneur, loving family man, and proven philanthropist who has spent the last 30 years building an empire, adoring his children, and working to uplift the Black community. He is an imperfect person, but is not criminal. To his credit, Mr. Combs has been nothing but cooperative with this investigation, and he voluntarily relocated to New York last week in anticipation of these charges. Please reserve your judgment until you have all the facts. These are the acts of an innocent man with nothing to hide, and he looks forward to clearing his name in court. That was a look inside Diddy's infamous white parties. It remains to be seen if any celebrity attendees will be interviewed by the feds or called to testify. But if that does happen, we'll have the latest. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.